The more you care about Dragon Age the Veilguard's world and its many characters, the more likely it is that they will all survive the game's final epic battle. And conversely, the less you care about the personal problems of your companions, the greater the chance that they are all going to die. On the one hand, then, it's nice that the player is suitably rewarded for spending extra time supporting the heroes of the Veilguard through their individual quests and strengthening the forces of their allies. But at the same time, this does mean that what is arguably the game's best and most dramatic ending is reserved exclusively for those who don't bother with much of anything beyond the main quest. As someone who often seeks out the worst case scenario in any game with multiple endings, I am willing to admit that I genuinely wanted things to go as badly as possible at the end of my first playthrough. And I was not in the least bit disappointed with how good the game's bad ending is. Though the Veilguard has plenty of obvious issues, the game's finale is a brilliantly paced and beautifully executed sequence regardless of the specific outcome, with just the right mix of tough choices, engaging combat, and cinematic moments. And while each of the game's 4 possible endings will appeal in different ways to different people, and largely serve to give the player exactly what they want from the conclusion, I firmly believe that the bad ending is the best, and the ending which the game seems to guide most players towards is the absolute worst.
We have to go now.
No time to scrape up an army, even if we had one.
You think we're enough?
They've had time to prepare. It'll be brutal.
We may not all make it out again.
Yeah. But if we're going down, let's go down swinging.
After many long hours of fighting monsters and making new friends, punctuated by the occasional chat with your friendly neighborhood Dreadwolf, you'll eventually track down the last of the Evanuris to Tearstone Island. There, you'll briefly part ways either with Manic Pixie Mage Girl Balara or Detective Nev Sherlock Gallus, when they're kidnapped by Ganan after dismantling a magical ward. And then, shortly after that, you'll finally defeat the horrifying tentacle lady Ganan by sacrificing either the dutiful Grey Warden Davrin or Dwarven Rockstar Lace Harding. Because, even though the Veilguard's ending does allow you to save everyone else, unfortunately one of these two will have to end up with a Ganan tendril through their chest. Either way, with one elven god taken care of, Rook will unceremoniously be pulled through the veil and imprisoned in the Fade by Solas, who then does a runner with his magic blue knife. It's at this point, in a cage built upon regret, when you discover that Solas has been messing with Rook's mind in order to convince them that Varric was still alive when he actually died in the game's prologue, which is a genuinely nice little twist, chiefly because it makes all of Varric's weird behavior throughout the game suddenly makes sense, and also because it provides Rook with yet another reason to want to thwart the Dreadwolf's plans. Even if it does require some slightly contrived magical grief counseling to get there. After escaping from Solas's Fade cage a few days or weeks after your initial imprisonment, you will soon have another chance to get more of your companions killed. While you've been gone, Ganan has settled down in Mimrathus, Thadis' various factions have waged war against his evil minions, and the heroes of the Veilguard have been busy making fake daggers. Meanwhile, Solas has failed to clean up his mess despite fighting plenty of blight tentacles, and after all his shenanigans will ultimately be only too happy to hand his magic blue knife back to Rook. As you launch your final assault on Ganan and his army, you are faced with a series of tricky tactical decisions. You can send one of your magically skilled buddies to help the Veil Jumpers break a ward, or you can send someone to do a terrible job and get Strife killed. You can send an assassin to deal with a Venatori big boss and they might manage it, or they might end up dead. You can send seasoned heroes to turn the tide of war, or incompetent warriors to get themselves squished. And as great as it might be witnessing your compatriots succeed, it's arguably a lot more compelling watching them fall one by one fighting this last hopeless battle. Basically, any companion who is a hero of the Veilguard after finishing their personal questline will likely survive here. So not finishing these loyalty quests will ensure they all die instead. And if they all die, then the player is locked into the worst possible outcome at the end, even if this worst ending might actually be the best. Choosing to completely ignore a hastily concocted fake dagger plan, Rook embraces the rage building within and charges towards Solas, who ably fights back by turning the last remaining Veilguard heroes to stone and stabbing Rook with the lyrium dagger. Then, with both of their blood on the blade forging the necessary link, Rook grabs hold of Solas and pulls him towards the Veil, making the ultimate sacrifice to deal with the Dreadwolf and seal up the Veil for good. In a game which can sometimes be painfully upbeat and unserious, this ending forces its heroes to dismiss their petty troubles and throw down their lives to save Thedas. Recalling the use of blood magic which connected Rook and Solas in the prologue, this sacrifice ties their lives together in a final uneasy unity which serves to heal the rift that they are both in some sense responsible for creating. It bridges the gap that stood between them in their conversations throughout the game, and gives a great deal more meaning to the story of their troubled relationship. It justifies the individual sacrifices of every other character, and makes Rook a selfless hero without the need for spontaneous tricks or unnatural dialogue to force a resolution. The struggle between these opposing forces in these final moments feels real and purposeful, and it concludes both of their stories together without compromise. While sending Solas into the Fade on his own feels like the fairy tale happy ending that the game wants the player to want, Rook going down with the ship feels like a tragic inevitability dutifully executed. He becomes the true Veilguard by keeping Solas in place, and this final image of your two companions turned to stone at the precipice of the Veil is just as poignant. However the game ends, the Veil is successfully restored, but only in this ending, I think, does it feel like the cost properly equates to the result. And that honestly makes it worth avoiding companion missions and side quests initially, simply to be able to see this dramatic sequence, even though the other options are obviously much happier endings.
Please, Rook. I do not wish to fight against you.
If you're willing to put in the hours required to ensure that most, if not all, of your companions survive the Battle of Minrathous, then the game seems to primarily guide you towards an ending which is arguably the worst possible outcome. After escaping the Fade and before you head for the final showdown in Minrathous, your companions will show you a nifty little replica of the lyrium dagger that Solas stole back when he imprisoned Rook. And after some discussion later on, once you're on the ground in the city, the gang conceive of a plan to trick the Dreadwolf with this fake blade, in order to weaken him enough that he can be tied to the Veil and seal it back up. Then, once you've defeated Ganan, you will finally have the opportunity to pull off this sneaky switcheroo and give Solas the fake dagger. And sure enough, he will attempt to use it even though it seems dodgy, and the backlash will allow Rook to get in and draw his blood with the real dagger before shoving him backwards into the Veil. And that's great and all, except for the fact that it feels a bit weird using this dagger here when it's only been introduced at the 11th hour and its origin is a bit random. You can, of course, choose to just fight Solas at this point instead of tricking him, and with a full team of Veilguard heroes, you will easily manage to jab him with the dagger and shove him towards the Veil without having to sacrifice Rook's life. And while I'd argue this is a much better paced and more interesting ending sequence, it also feels sort of wrong to take this path when you've already semi-committed to the dagger switcheroo. It makes me wish, honestly, that this fake blade scheme hadn't been an option at all. Firstly, because it seems unlikely that Solas would actually try to use this thing when he's obviously magically attuned enough to know that it's not real. And secondly, because it's just downright odd that they even went through the effort of making this thing while Rook was trapped in the Fade. I mean, I guess these heroes needed something to do while Rook wasn't around, but it just goes to show how much this merry band of misfits needs proper leadership, that their first instinct was to spend their time doing arts and crafts. I have to assume at some point prior to them losing the dagger, someone wrote down its exact measurements or made some sort of mold that would allow them to create such a perfect replica too. They clearly did an excellent job, but I just feel like the whole idea feels a bit undercooked when introduced this late in the game. And so for the ending to hinge upon the use of this fake feels very contrived. Maybe if we had recruited a companion early in the game who was sought out specifically for their replica crafting abilities, I'd have been more on board with the fake lyrium dagger plan. All that to say then that using the fake dagger here does soften the impact of the ending. But if you can ignore all the fake dagger stuff, then choosing to fight and defeat the Dreadwolf normally does make for a decent ending, even if it is a bit obvious. Of course, if you spend plenty of time in the crossroads, in addition to dealing with the personal problems of your companions, you might learn enough about the regrets of the Dreadwolf to ultimately find yourself face to face with Mythal, who will give you her essence in the form of a rather nice statuette once you've managed to kill her or convince her to help. Then, when faced with the choice between fighting Solas or tricking him with your fake dagger, you can also choose to convince the Dreadwolf to do the right thing and sacrifice himself to close the Veil. And you'll even get some help from Morrigan and the Inquisitor to do so. So, for anyone who loves Solas, hates conflict, or is deeply invested in the lore here, this is almost certainly the best ending. It requires investing some time into uncovering Solas's past and his motives, and helps recontextualize his actions to make him less of an obvious bad guy, which some people will love. As far as I'm concerned, this ending makes it a bit too easy to convince Solas to do the right thing, considering how set in his ways he is throughout the rest of the game. And I also don't love how it shifts the emphasis fully towards Solas, as opposed to Rook and the Veilguard, because I prefer him being a nuanced bad guy rather than a redeemable, misguided anti-hero. But I can understand why some people would prefer this ending over the rest, and I certainly like it better than the fake dagger thing at least. I feel I have to mention too that there is a secret end credits scene teasing the future of the franchise. And honestly, at this point, I'm mostly just choosing to ignore that that exists, rather than face the implications of what they're suggesting. It's clear that the Veilguard has moved the Dragon Age story forward a lot by resolving many of the old mysteries in good and bad ways. So they will need to find a new direction for the future. But that's a problem for another time.
I will go and seek atonement. Thanks to you, I now can see the way.
Ultimately, I don't think that any of the Veilguard's endings are unequivocally bad, because the game does such a fantastic job of bringing together all its elements for a final epic chapter. regardless of your choices. The ending has rightly been compared to Mass Effect 2's suicide mission, and in many ways it greatly improves on the spectacle and action in that brilliant sequence. But I do think it's worth noting that it feels a lot easier to get the good ending here in the Veilguard simply by doing every side quest, whereas in Mass Effect 2 the precarious companion dynamics made things much trickier, and it felt like there were many more places for things to go wrong along the way. I've already discussed why it's a problem that everyone is always so amicable in the Veilguard in a separate video, and I stand by everything I had to say there about the way conversations sabotage the story's momentum. But in the end, so long as you can adjust to the awkward patter of dialogue, it shouldn't ruin the game's brilliant conclusion. The game clearly wants the player to do everything they can to prepare for the final battle and save as many lives as possible, because it repeatedly insists that the only way you'll be able to defeat the elven gods is if everybody has dealt with their personal problems. And while I do love how most of these companion quests connect directly to the final threat in a very satisfying way, I think I actually preferred seeing things go terribly wrong before doing the quests required to prevent catastrophe. For example, I think it's great that fighting the giant skeleton monster during Emmerich's questline means that it doesn't turn up in the final battle. But without seeing this bony giant in action before going back to finish that mission, I probably would have assumed that we always end up fighting this juggernaut. The decisions you make during the companion questlines aren't especially meaningful, past deciding what each character's ultimate outfit is going to look like. But whether you choose to do these quests or not absolutely does make a difference in the end. I've always believed that the ending is the most important part of any story to get right, because it's that last moment, that final feeling that usually sticks with the audience the most. A bad ending can easily ruin a good story, just like a good ending can often redeem a bad one. And the Veilguard, for all its faults, does happily go out on a high note regardless of how you specifically handle Solas or who you lose along the way. The game rewards you for trying and punishes you for not caring in a very satisfying way. And while this finale doesn't solve all of its problems, it does leave me feeling good about the story of the Veilguard overall. But what did you think of Dragon Age the Veilguard's various endings? And which one was your favourite? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.